Hello. All right, here is another lecture video about weighted voting systems. And here we're going to talk about power indices, or indices, the plural of index, or a couple of ways you can actually like quantify the amount of power that someone in a voting system or coalition has, right? It's a way to put a number on it. Okay, so a power index is a numerical way of looking at the power in a weighted voting system, right? So there's one index called the Banzhof power index. I think Banzhof was a person. This has been around for a long time. It measures a player's ability to influence the outcome of a vote in general. Okay, so here is the big picture. Like, how do you calculate the Banzhof power index? So first you have to list all winning coalitions. Okay, so you have to list them all. Then for each coalition, you identify the players who are critical, right? And we're just going to like look at them, and you could circle them, you could underline them, you could do whatever you want. But you want to identify the players who are critical. And remember that critical players are players in a coalition whose votes are necessary, meaning that if their votes were removed, then the coalition would no longer meet quota. Okay. So after you've you've listed all the winning coalitions, identified all the critical players in each coalition, then you count how many times each player is critical, right? So you say, okay, in all these winning coalitions, player one was critical this many times, right? And then it doesn't say this, but because of what the fourth one does, you also need to know like how many times a player was critical, like total, like for all players. Like there were critical players, 27 times or whatever, because you need that number of total possible times a player was critical to do the fourth step here, which was convert the count from part 3 into a fractional decimal by dividing it by the total number of times any player was critical at all. So you would basically in when you do number 3 you would count how many times each player is critical, right? And then you would add those all up to get the denominator that you use for part 4. Okay, let's do an example. I'm going to leave a little thing there so we can see. Find the Banzhof power index for the weighted voting system. Okay, so I think the wording of that is a little confusing, because what do you mean find the Banzhof power index for the weighted voting system? Well, that just means find the Banzhof power index for each player, and then that list of numbers for each player is the Banzhof power index for the system, right? For the weighted voting system, because clearly, if you look at these steps that we're using to find the power index, it's per player, right? So you're going to get a number for every player, and then that collection of numbers is the thing for the whole system. Okay, so first we have to list all the winning coalitions, right? So this is probably the hardest part, because you have to look at your weighted voting system and look at your quota and look at the different possibilities and just find them all. So I would recommend that you do some sort of systematic approach, right? Don't just start saying, well, okay, here's one that's winning, here's one that's winning. Like really try and do it systematically so that you are sure that you've kind of found them all. So here is what I would do. So first, I'm just going to do a little labeling just for my eyeballs. Okay, so this is our quota, right? Our quota is 36. This is player 1 has 20 votes. Player 2 has 17 votes. Player 3 has 16 votes. And player 4 has 3 votes. Okay, what is the total number of votes? I just always like to know this. That's 20 plus 17 plus 16 plus 3. I really don't think this is necessary information, but for some reason I always want to know. I don't think we need to use it in this case, but there are 56 votes. Okay. Oh, dang it. I closed the calculator. I didn't want to do that. Okay. Well, I'm going to need it, so let me open it up again. Hopefully it'll open in the same place it closed. Oh, waiting. Okay, no, it did not. I'm just going to move it over here. Okay. All right. So there were 56 votes. I don't know why I wanted to know that, but I did, but that doesn't matter. Okay. So we need to list all the winning coalitions. Okay, so let's see. So I'm thinking the quota is 36. We're looking for groups of players that are going to have more than or equal to 36 votes in their coalition. Okay. So this is how I would do it systematically. I would say, okay, I'm going to start looking at coalitions. Let's start with player one. Right now, notice how no one is a dictator. So we're not going to have any single player coalitions, right, that are winning. So we know we're not going to do that. I would start maybe, what about, so there's lots of ways you could approach this. I'm trying to decide. So you could approach it saying like kind of by player, like, can I list all the winning coalitions that player one is a part of? Right? That's one way you could approach it. Or you could approach it maybe by size, like, let me list all the possible winning coalitions that have exactly 2 players. And then let me list all possible winning coalitions that have 3 players. Both of those approaches, I think, are good approaches, and it really depends on what fits for you. I think I'm going to go with the first one. I think I'm going to go with, let's see if we can list all possible winning coalitions that contain player one, no matter the size, right? I'm going to start with the small ones and then we'll go forward. Okay, so we're talking now, we want player one in these coalitions. We want to list all winning coalitions that contain player one. Well, if you put player one in there, like we said, he's not a dictator, so alone he can't do anything. But if you add player two, who has 17 votes, then that is already a winning coalition. Bam. And it's, my curly braces are awful. Just know that this is my attempt to make a curly brace. If I really slow down and focus, I can kind of do them okay, but oh my gosh. Oh, trying to get them the same size. I think I'm going to just forget it. Okay, so player one and player two together, they are a winning coalition because they have 37 votes and the quota is 36. Okay, so what that also means, though, is that any other coalition that contains player one and player two, plus extra people, is also winning. So let's just make all those coalitions. Like, we already know they're winning. The other players are kind of like, they're kind of useless, but they do count as a coalition, right? So what I'm saying is if we have player one and player two, and if we add player three in there, that's also going to be a winning coalition, right? Player one and player two, let's add just player four in there. That's also a winning coalition, right? And then, of course, if we had player one, two, three, and four, that would also be a winning coalition. So player one, player two, player three, player four, bam. Those are all winning coalitions that contain player one. Right? We've got one and two. We've got one, two, three. Oh, actually, I'm thinking maybe we've missed one. What about 1, 3, 4? Right. Okay, so actually, these are all winning coalitions that contain both players 1 and 2. That's what's going on here. Those are all possible winning coalitions that contain players 1 and 2. Now, if you don't have player 2, can you still have winning coalitions with player 1? Let's do that. So what if we put player 1 in here, but for a minute, we're going to ignore player 2 and say, okay, because we've already listed the ones with both player 1 and player 2. So what about just player 1? If we add player 3 in there, is that a winning coalition? 20 plus 16 is 36. That's quota. Indeed it is. Okay, so player 1 and player 3, they are a winning coalition. So therefore, if we just add in player 4, right, the other player, that's also going to be a winning coalition because we already know that players 1 and 3 together are winning. So if we add more people, it's also going to be winning. Okay. Player 1. All right. Now you could think about what we've just done is we've listed all the winning coalitions that contain player 1 and player 3 that we haven't already listed. Okay. Yes, that's true. All right. Now, what if we ignore player 1 for a minute and get player 2 in there? Let's ignore player 1. Are there any winning coalitions that have player 2 but don't have player 1? Let's see. Player 2 has 17 votes and player 3 has 16. What does that add up to? 7 plus 6 is 13. That's 33. Okay, so player 2 and player 3 alone do not have a winning coalition. But if you add in player 4, they do. So you can't have one with just 2 and 3. That's winning, but you can have one with 2, 3, and 4. That's winning. Okay. I think that's all of them. Now, I think I might actually take a few minutes here. Like, if you're satisfied with this, go ahead and skip the next few minutes. But I'm going to take a minute and see if I can do the same thing, but going by size of coalition. So let me just write here. I'm going to rewrite our voting system. 36, we've got 20, 17, 16, 3. So this is me I'm doing the same thing I just did. I'm trying to list all winning coalitions, but I'm going to do it in a little different way. So I'm going to try and do it first by I'm going to go by size of coalition. So we know there are no dictators, so there are no single player coalitions that are winning. What about 2-player coalitions that are winning? Okay. 2-player winning coalitions. I'm going to abbreviate coalition. Okay, so let's see. We know that player 1 and player 2 together, that's a winning coalition. What about player 1 and player 3? Is that winning? Indeed it is. Player 1 and player 3, they have 36. What about player 1 and player 4? All right, I'm looking at player 1 and player 4. No, they do not make quota. So there are 2 winning coalitions that have 2 players in them. And does that match with what we have? Indeed, that does match. Okay. All right, so that's 2-player winning coalitions. What about 3-player? I'm going to be lazy and not write winning coalitions. Okay. So obviously, if player 1 and player 2 are winning together, then anything with those 2. So if we just add in player 3, there's one. Take player 1 and player 2 and add in player 4, and there's one. Okay. We already know that player 1 and 3 together make a winning coalition. So any other coalition with players 1 and 3 will also. So if we add in player 2, we see that we've already done that here, so we don't have to do it again. So let's add in player 4. So now that's 1, 3, 4. And they are also a winning coalition. They must be, because players 1 and 3 alone, and this is a 3 here. So 3 make a winning coalition. Okay, let's see. What about 2, 3, 4? Notice that we don't have a coalition with 2, 3, 4. And that is indeed a winning coalition. Player 2, player 3, player 4. Okay, so I think those are all the 3-player coalitions. So there are 4 of them. Let's see, do we have 4 3-players over here that we had listed? 1, 2, 3, 4. Indeed. Okay, so that's good. Now, what about 4-player coalitions? Well, there's only 4 players, so the 4-player coalition is everybody, which would definitely be a winning coalition. So that's player 1, player 2, player 3, player 4. Okay. So how many winning coalitions is this? 1, 2, 3. Oops, get out of there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 winning coalitions. Is that how many we had over here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes. And so if you compare, I'm going to try and show both of these at one time. It makes it very small. But if you can see, we have listed the same coalitions. We kind of found them in a different order, but they are the same 7 coalitions. So you can, whatever system works for you, you should use it. What just happened? Go, what? Okay, here we go. I kind of like them both, right? But you do have to, if you've never done anything like this, where you're trying to sort of like make all possible subgroups, right? Here, it's not all possible subgroups, but all possible subgroups that are also winning coalitions. It might take a little practice, right? Because you got to really notice, like, pay attention to like what you've included and what you haven't. So that's why a systematic approach is helpful. All right, so these are all the winning coalitions. Okay. We like it. Now what we want to do is in each coalition, identify the players who are critical. Okay, so I think I'm just going to underline them. I'm going to underline them in red in the coalitions themselves. That's an easy way to do it. I think most books do it that way, if I remember correctly. Well, okay, so let's remind ourselves. So what does it mean to be critical? A player is critical if they are a member of a winning coalition, and if you remove their votes, the coalition is no longer winning. Okay, so their votes are necessary to reach quota. Okay, our quota is 36. Let's take a look. So we're just going to start at the beginning, start here. Okay, so player 1 and player 2, 20 votes, 17 votes. Both of those players are needed to reach quota. Okay, so in that coalition, they are both critical. So I'm just going to underline critical players. Underline critical players. You could circle them, you could do whatever you want. I'm going to underline them. Okay. So in that first coalition, both players in the coalition are critical, because if you removed either of their votes, then the coalition would no longer be winning. All right. All right. So that's that one. What about the next one? Player 1, 2, 3. So we need 36. Okay. What is the, I'm just thinking, what is the weight of this coalition? The weight of this coalition, player 1 has 20, player 2 has not 14, but 17, and player 3 has 16. Okay, so that coalition has weight 53. So if I take 53, if I take away player 3's votes, which is 16, do we fall under quota? No. So player 3 is not critical, because if we take away player 3's votes from the weight of this coalition, we're still above quota. All right, what about player 2? 53, player 2 is 17. So no, player 2 is also not critical, because if you take away player 2's votes, you're still at quota with player 1 and player 3. All right. What about player 1? So the weight of the coalition is 53. If you take out player 1's votes, which is 20, indeed, you fall below quota. So player 1 is critical. Okay, so does that make sense? We just checked each player. We removed their votes. If their votes brought the coalition below quota, then they are not critical. If it does bring them below quota, then they are critical. And player 1 was the only one. So that player 3 and player 1 together can make up quota, right? And player 2 and player 1 together can make up quota. But players 2 and 3 together do not make quota. Okay. All right, so the only critical player in that one is player 1. All right, next one. What is the weight of this coalition? Okay, so I'm just going to remind myself here that the weight of this coalition was 53. What's the weight of the next coalition? Player 1 is 20, plus player 2 is 17, plus player 4. Who's player 4? 3. Okay, so the weight of that coalition is 40. All right. So I can see right away that player 4 is not going to be critical, because 40 minus 3 is 37, right? But I think the other two players are going to be critical. So let's just double check. So we've got the weight of our coalition is 40. If we subtract out player 2's votes, oops, I added 40 minus 17, right? 23. Yeah, so player 2 is critical. And what if we subtract out player 1's votes? I mean, clearly they're both going to be critical. Okay, so player in this coalition with players 1, 2, and 4, players 1 and 2 are both critical because without their votes, the coalition weight falls below quota. Okay. What about 1, 2, 3, 4? So the entire weight of the coalition. Oh, that's the thing I wanted to know at the beginning. So it actually does kind of play a role here. I don't remember. I think it was 56. I'm going to add them together again just to make sure. 20 plus 17 plus 16 plus 3, that's 56. Yeah. So the weight of this coalition is 56. That's the total weight of the voting system. So who is critical? Right. Clearly, player 4 is not critical because if you take 56 and you minus those 3 votes for player 4, you're not critical. Okay. What about player 3? They have 16 votes. Does that fall below 36? Nope. So player 3 is not critical. What about player 2? If I take away the 17, nope, that's not critical either. What about if I take away player 1's votes? No. So in the entire weighted voting system, no one is critical, right? If you have all 4 people in the coalition, removing any one person's votes does not reduce the number of votes to below quota. Right. Could I think of a more complicated way to say that? Okay. So nobody's critical in that coalition. Now, is there another word we get? So if nobody's critical, that means that no one has veto power, right? There's no one there with the power who's if they remove their vote, then the coalition can't win. That's not true. So no one has veto power in that system. All right, let's do P1 and P3. What's the weight of that voting system? So they've got 20 plus, not system, but coalition, 16, player 1 and player 3. So they have 36. Okay, so they exactly reach quota. So taking either of them out is going to go below quota. So that means they're both critical. Does that make sense? All right, what about if we have a coalition where we add player 4 in there? So that's going to be 20 plus 16 plus 3. That's 39. Okay, so if we take away player 4 votes, we do 39 minus their 3. That's still quota, so player 4 is not critical. But if we take away player 2's votes, or player 3 votes, I mean, which is 16, that falls below, so player 3 is critical. And if we take away, obviously, player 1's votes, they're critical too. Okay, so in that coalition, players 1 and 3 are both critical. Yes, because if you take away player 3's votes, you fall below quota. And if you take away player 1's votes, you fall below quota. Okay, so we've done that one. And finally, 2, 3, 4. All right, so that's 17, 16, and 3. Here, I'll just slide over so we can see the calculator and the coalition we're talking about. So let's see, let's add those together. 17 plus 16 plus 3. Oh, so that coalition exactly meets quota. Therefore, all players are critical, right? Because if you take away any of those votes, you're going to fall below quota. Okay. So they are all critical in that coalition. All right, so that's the first step. I'm going to erase my check marks because we don't need them anymore. All right, so we have listed all winning coalitions, and we have identified the players who are critical in those coalitions. Okay. Now what do we do? Number 3, count how many times each player is critical. Okay, so we need to write this down. Okay, so player 1 is critical. How many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 times. All right, player 2 is critical. How many times? 1, 2, 3. Player 2 is critical 3 times. All right, what about player 3? Oh, player 3 is critical. Where? 1, 2, 3. Also 3 times. And then player 4 is player 4. Yeah, player 4 is critical. Is critical. Oh, I'm writing with blue. Okay, that's fine. Just 1 time though. Player 4 is only underlined up here once. So 1 time. I wrote times. It really we would say 1 time, right? But who cares? All right, so we need to add these all up to get to, because remember step 4 is to convert the counts we just did to fractions or decimals by dividing by the total number of times any player was critical, right? So we need to know all together. So 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 1. That is 8, 9, 12. Yes, 12. Okay. So then the Banzhof power index, Banzhof power index. Okay. So for player 1, we're going to do, 5 divided by 12. All right, so let's just write them all down and then we'll go look at what, because that's a fraction. It's a perfectly fine fraction, right? So if you think about like, there are 12 times that the player is critical. Player 1 is critical 5 of those 12 times. So you can kind of see how it's a kind of a good measure of well, I mean, it's a informative measure of how much power, right? Almost half the times that anyone is important, player 1 is important. All right, so what about player 2? They are 3 out of 12, right? Which hopefully we know that's the same as 1/4. Player 3 is also 3 out of 12, and player 1 is 1 out of 12. Okay, so those are the Banzhof power indexes or indices as fractions. We could do decimals, or we could even do percents, right? So let me slide this over, bring up the calculator here. So let's look at the decimals. So player 1 is 5 divided by 12. Okay. So that decimal, right, the calculator, the 6s repeating, in this case, that is indeed, it's true, the decimal equivalent has 6s on forever, so it stops at some point and rounds it, because the next digit, would have been 6 also, so that digit rounds up to 7. So we could do a lot of things. We want to say like, that's 0.4166. We could say that, that 6 is repeating. But we could also give it a percentage, right? We could say that's about, and we could round this to about 42%, right? So you could say that in this weighted voting system, power 1 has about 42% of the power. If you want to say it like that, right? You could. Okay. I wonder if there's a way to keep this. I'm wondering if there's a way to keep this on top without always in front. Yeah, so I don't want it to go away when I write on the screen. Okay. So then 3 divided by 12, well, that's 1/4, it should be 0.25, right? So that's exactly equal to 0.25, which we could say is 25%, which means that's the same thing for this guy, because it was also 3/12. And then what about 1/12? 1 divided by 12, 0.083 repeating. So that's about 8.3%, right? About. I guess we could have, maybe rounded this one to 1 decimal place for 41.7%, right? So that listing of all the percentages or decimals or fractions, whatever, for all the players, you could think of that as the Banzhof power index for the weighted voting system, right? So this list of numbers is the index for the system. Each individual number is the index for the individual player. And it kind of gives you an idea of how the power is distributed in this weighted voting system. Player 1 has more power than everybody else. Player 2 and player 3 have about the same amount of power, and player 1 has the smallest amount of power. It is interesting to note that players 2 and 3 have the same quantity, right? Have the same number in the Banzhof power index, even though they have different numbers of votes in the weighted voting system. Now, it is true that they're very close, right? 17 and 16 are pretty close. It's just interesting to note that you can have the same power index, even though you have different number of votes. Okay, so that is the Banzhof power index. Let's go over it one more time. First, have to list all the winning coalitions. I really encourage you to do that systematically in some way so that you actually catch them all. If you have trouble with that, definitely contact me. We can talk about it and we can go through it together. And then in each coalition, you just have to identify who is critical and just mark it somehow, right? Remember, critical means that if you remove their votes, that coalition, the weight of that coalition falls below quota. Then you just go through and count how many times each player is critical, and I will just list that. And of course, you need to add those together to do the fourth step, which is convert the counts from step 3 into fractions of decimals or percents by finding the proportion of times a particular player was critical to the total number of times players were critical. All right, that is Banzhof power index. There is another power index, which I think I might do as a how long is this video? I don't know how long it's been. Oh, let's just do it. Let's do it in this video too. Sequential coalitions and pivotal power, right? So we got some new stuff going on here. You know what? I've changed my mind. I think if you're watching this video and you haven't done the homework on Banzhof power, now is the time to maybe go and try a couple. And if you haven't read the book yet, don't not do that, right? Definitely go and take a look at the book because there are more examples in the book, and sometimes he gives a little more information in the book. So I think I'm going to stop this video here, and then I will come with another one and do the sequential coalition and pivotal power stuff. Alrighty, see you then.